I recently put out a video debunking Richard Dawkins' unscientific claims on trans issues. One of them was the notion that sex is a binary. This is a statement that is very easy to disprove, which I did in the video. And what I found very interesting and quite telling was the fact that almost all of the negative comments the video received focused exclusively on this detail, to an almost obsessive degree, refusing to accept this scientific reality. So I have decided to spend a little more time on it and make a video specifically about this, to analyze what this debate truly represents a bit more. Sex being a binary is a core element of TERF rhetoric. TERFs follow the conservative mentality of prescriptivism and naturalistic reasoning. So they argue that sex is a binary by nature, which means only males and females can possibly exist. Then they conflate sex with gender and argue that only men and women can exist. Therefore, trans people are freaks and they have no right to exist. Of course, not every TERF is this militant. Since most people, especially those in the scientific community, are accepting of trans people, some TERFs opt for the strategy of taking the plausible deniability route, like J.K. Rowling or Richard Dawkins, who don't outright say that trans people should be eradicated, but they do employ language that dehumanizes them, fosters othering, and promotes legislature that either invalidates their existence or denies them access to healthcare. Predictably, Dawkins employs the TERF argument that sex is a binary, while ignoring gender as a made-up or fictitious concept. In reality, trans issues focus on gender while largely ignoring sex. TERFs obsessively focus on sex, because it's a convenient strategic outpost for attacking trans people while maintaining plausible deniability. This is called the Motte-Bailey fallacy. A Motte-Bailey fallacy occurs when a person makes a controversial claim, and when challenged, they retreat to a more defensible position. In politics, it is very common for people to employ this fallacy in the form of disguising the Bailey as the Motte. So when a person holds an indefensible position, they try to reframe it as something less controversial. Everyone knows what the person actually believes, but whenever challenged, the person and their supporters pretends to only believe the reframed version of their position through plausible deniability. This fallacy is usually communicated through dog whistles. For example, J.K. Rowling famously employed this fallacy when she started attacking trans people. When criticized, she immediately retreated to the Motte, arguing that she never hated trans people, she was just acknowledging the reality of sex, and started playing the victim. People who held similar anti-trans views immediately leapt to defending J.K. Rowling's Motte, acting innocent and pretending that they mean no ill will towards trans people, they just care very deeply about the scientific definition of sex and wish to preserve it. In fact, the very phrase "sex is a binary" has become a dog whistle as an anti-trans signal. This phrase is almost exclusively uttered in the context of expressing anti-trans rhetoric. In the past 2 weeks, after I posted my video debunking Richard Dawkins' views on trans people, I have come in contact with dozens of people who froth at the mouth in their insistence of defending the integrity of the sex binary model. All of them claiming to be great scholars who somehow didn't understand even the most basic concepts of their own field. The correct and most common way of addressing the Motte-Bailey fallacy is to refocus the discussion back onto the Bailey, the topic at hand, and refusing any derailment, which is what I did in my previous video. I explained how Dawkins was conflating sex and gender, and why a phrase like "woman with a penis" is both semasiologically valid and a great way to raise consciousness about the linguistic limitations of outdated definitions. In this video, I'm going to be tackling the Motte. I will explain why asserting that sex is a binary is actually incorrect and in opposition to the current scientific consensus. You see, the reason TERFs love to obsess over sex all the time is not just because it is easy to conflate it with gender and thus promote their bigotry. It's also a way to undermine the scientific connection between sex and gender. They focus on sex because sex is real, while ignoring gender because that's just made up. In reality, both sex and gender are equally real, or equally made up, depending on your epistemological leanings. Disproving the sex binary is actually very easy. As it is with any absolutist claim, all you need to counter a statement like this is to provide an example to the contrary. In simple terms, if someone claims that all sheep are white, all you have to do to disprove it is to find one sheep that isn't white. In the case of sex in humans, if there is even one person who isn't male or female, then sex can't be a binary. Obviously, there are plenty of such examples, which we'll get to later, so sex can't be a binary. Richard Dawkins himself knows this, but he circumvents it using mental gymnastics.
Sex is one of the very few, actually, true binary divisions that we have in biology. All sorts of other things like large and versus small, old versus young, etc. These are all continua, but sex really isn't a continuum. It is a straight binary. The number of possible intermediates is negligible, vanishingly small, if any at all, and so the division between the microgamete producing sex and the macrogamete producing sex, which in the case of mammals is also labeled by the XXXY chromosome system, means that in my dictionary at least, you cannot change sex. You can change gender, where gender is a kind of fictive sex, the sex that you feel that you are, or you can retain the gender that you feel you are. That's another matter. That's a psychological question, and I'm a biologist, and I answer as a biologist.
Dawkins acknowledges the existence of intermediacies in the spectrum of sex, but he argues that those intermediacies are very rare and therefore should be ignored. This is simply bad logic and bad science. You can't ignore data points that contradict your hypothesis. When you propose a model, and that model can't account for all the possible cases of the phenomenon it describes, then that model is obviously flawed and incomplete. In science, when this happens, we amend the theory and improve it, which we have, and that's why we no longer claim that sex is a binary. Dawkins, however, follows the tactics of a religious apologist. Instead of throwing away the disproven hypothesis, he throws away the evidence that disproves it, and that's why Dawkins has become a fucking joke. But let's entertain his reasoning for a moment, just to see how absurd it is. Dawkins says that these intermediacies are vanishingly rare. So how rare are they? Well, intersex people alone make up 1.7% of the population. That's not rare by biological standards. That's about 130 million people, currently alive right now. That's more than the population of Japan. It's an entire country of people. Apparently all those people don't count, according to Dawkins. Their existence should be ignored by our scientific terminology. That's how dumb this argument is. This isn't the first time Dawkins has done this, by the way. When he was asked about the biological causes for gender identity, he simply refused to answer the question.
Okay, Marcos wants to know on X how genes relate to sexual orientations and gender.
Sexual orientation, I take that means homosexual, heterosexual, that kind of thing.
Right.
It's difficult to investigate these things. One of the ways to do it is twin studies, where you look at, if you have a pair of identical twins and if one of them is gay, is there a strong tendency for the other one to be gay? And the answer is yes. If you compare that with fraternal twins, with non-identical twins, who share only half the genes, as opposed to all of them, of the relevant ones. So yes, there is a genetic component to sexual orientation, and that I believe is established. It doesn't mean it's inevitable, but that there is a strong strong genetic component to the variation.
He acknowledges that genetics play a part in forming sexual orientation, but then conveniently ignores the second part of the question, because he knows that if he acknowledges the biological reality of gender identity, it will destroy his entire position on trans issues. Dawkins does this kind of thing all the time nowadays. The guy who once embraced the idea of having one's views challenged as a principle now exhibits blatant intellectual cowardice by literally refusing to acknowledge inconvenient questions, which is why his Q&A videos feature only the most softball questions, and he can't even answer those. Here's another example where he is specifically asked about the limitations of the binary sex model, and he responds with irrelevant nonsense.
Matter. Could it be that psychology plays a more significant role in shaping the lived experience of gender than the biological binary?
Yes, I mean,
second.
if anything shapes it, it would be psychology. There are people who psychologically feel themselves to be in the wrong body. I mean, I read long ago the book Conundrum by Jan Morris, who started out as James Morris, and I was pretty convinced by her feeling of unease that she was born into the wrong body, and she, as it were, she showed her credentials by going through a horrendous series of operations and hormone treatments and things. So she really meant it. I have rather less time for people who it looks as though they, say, want to break female swimming records or something, and so just stand up and announce, I am from henceforth a woman, and therefore I'm allowed to go in for women's swimming competitions. I don't have much time for them. I think that they might very well be chances.
In case you forgot, that was Dawkins answering the question, could it be that psychology plays a more significant role in shaping the lived experience of gender than the often overly simplistic biological binary? Dawkins said yes, maybe, and then started impersonating Joe Biden. But what is the answer to the question Dawkins was asked? Well, the best answer I can give is that we don't fully know yet, but we do know that gender is affected by many different factors, including sex variations. So it's not just psychology. So what exactly is sex? What does the science say? Well, first of all, sex is not just one thing, and any attempt to narrowly define it, like arguing that sex is solely defined by gamete size, is going to be reductive and therefore inaccurate. Because of evolution, biology itself is an extremely diverse continuum because it is constantly in flux. Every phenomenon has its exceptions, and every manifestation presents in many different ways. Even something seemingly obvious like humans have 5 fingers in each hand would be an incorrect statement because there are humans with polydactyly. We can't ignore phenomena just because they don't fit in the box we try to put them in. This is what a lot of people forget, by the way. The words we use to describe things are words we invented with inherent limitations. Every term we use, male, female, sex, gender, these are all constructed terms to describe things we use around us. We must never get confused and start believing that the world around us is defined by these terms. So what do we mean when we say sex? Simply put, sex refers to the trait that determines the type of gamete a sexually reproducing organism produces. Not every organism reproduces sexually, and not every organism that reproduces sexually consists of males and females. Humans reproduce sexually in an anisogamic way, meaning that we do have males and females. The terms male and female have been arbitrarily defined to correspond to the smaller and bigger gamete respectively. In simple terms, we have created the convention to refer to any organism that produces the larger gamete as female and the organism that produces the smaller gamete as male. The reason we have defined these two sexes is not because it reflects some kind of divine truth about the universe. It's simply the only possible way to define them from a mathematical standpoint. If we have two sortable unequal values, then obviously one is going to be larger than the other. We call the larger one female and the smaller male. That's all. It's just a naming convention. This is what TERFs have been obsessing over since the 1970s. They present this as some kind of precious scientific truth that needs to be preserved at all costs. In reality, it's just a label we invented to facilitate communication. The irony here is that Richard Dawkins himself has talked about this in the past. In his own 1989 book, The Selfish Gene, Dawkins explains at length how the naming convention is completely arbitrary and we could have simply named them Sex 1 and Sex 2 if we wanted to. We just use male and female because it retroactively coincided with our cultural norms. And this is another ironic aspect of it all, because the idea of defining male and female by gamete size is new in itself, as it only occurred after extensive research on gametes in the 19th century. Before the 16th century, many Western scientists subscribed to the theory of one sex, where the male and the female were considered to be mutually and symmetrically inverse, thus representing the same one sex. This notion also conformed with religious beliefs of the time, especially Christianity, which posited that Eve was created out of Adam. It took over a millennium for people to widely accept the two-sex model. From Aristotle and Galen in classical antiquity, to Andreas Vesalius during the Renaissance and Scientific Revolution, to Carl Linnaeus during the Enlightenment. Throughout all this time, many people, including scientists and philosophers, expressed resistance in adopting the new two-sex model. The same resistance is expressed today, now that the two-sex model has been expanded. There will always be people standing in the way of scientific progress. As I said earlier, a lot of people seem to forget that the scientific words we use to describe the world around us are just words we have invented. When we realize that these words are inadequate to accurately describe the world as we observe it, we find new words, or we amend the meaning of pre-existing words. Some people choose to stubbornly cling on to old words and old definitions, refusing to adapt to the ever-changing world of science. This is the exact same mentality as that of people who get irrationally angry about the fact that they can't say words like nigger or faggot any longer. Both literally use the same argumentations to defend using outdated definitions, and the intent is always the same, utilizing language to attack specific target groups, either directly or indirectly. This is why anti-trans advocates often resort to rhetoric like, "facts don't care about your feelings." It's textbook projection. Given their emotional investment to the words they use, they desperately want them to be factual, because that would justify their desire to hurt other people with them. This is why they employ sophistry and fallacious reasoning to invert how male and female are defined. Their argument is that since male and female are defined by gamete size, then sex itself as a concept is also defined by gamete size, and since only male and female exist, sex is a binary. This, of course, is circular reasoning and also inverses the flow of definitions. This type of fallacious rhetoric can appear convincing to people who have difficulty grasping the differences between description and prescription. In reality, sex is characterized by many different factors, hence the term sexual characteristics, all of which can present in many variations. The fact that we tend to categorize these variations as only male or female is simply a naming convention, not a prescriptive statement about the reality of what we call sex. That being said, even if we were to define sex purely by gamete size, which would be an extremely reductive definition, the concept of a strict binary can still be challenged. There's a phenomenon called simultaneous hermaphroditism, and it's not even rare. For example, most coral species are simultaneous hermaphrodites. This means that they produce both male and female gametes. Even sex determination doesn't apply to such organisms, so they literally aren't male or female by definition. There are species of algae that exhibit different gamete sizes depending on circumstance, even though they are isogamic. In fact, algae research suggests that the very concept of anisogamy may evolve through disruption of the balance between gamete size and number. And that is the point a lot of people are missing. The biodiversity that exists in this world is so immense that it would be a huge mistake to use our observations and conventions prescriptively. As I said earlier, we use words to describe the world around us. That doesn't mean that the world is confined by the words we use. On the contrary, our words should constantly evolve to account for newer discoveries or newer understandings. A strict binary definition of sex based on gamete size simply does not account for the vast array of reproductive strategies or variations that exist in nature. So how is sex defined if not by gamete size? In our current understanding, sex is a highly complex and multidimensional system where many different things like chromosomes, hormones, genetics, and environmental factors all play a role in the development of an individual's sex. The model of sex as a binary is simply too reductive to account for all the possible variations. In its broadest application, the sex binary would become meaningless, as we would have to call individuals male or female without accounting for their genotypical or phenotypical variations. Yes, we could theoretically continue to call a person with full female phenotypicality a male because their undescended testes produce non-viable sperm, but what would be the point? This idea of strict adherence to outdated definitions out of blind loyalty to semantics reverses the purpose of language, and instead of language serving humanity, it asserts that humanity should be serving language. Needless to say, this doesn't make any sense. If someone really wants to continue using a strict two-sex model, it would be far more accurate to state that sex is bimodal instead of a binary, as it presents in two distinct maximum states most of the time, but also exhibits variations and intermediacies. Of course, bimodality is not a perfect model either, since sex is multidimensional and therefore can't be represented in a traditional single axis as many people seem to expect, but it's a far more accurate model than a binary. An apt comparison would be the autism spectrum, where the concept of one person being more or less autistic than someone else is meaningless. A mathematical comparison would be the complex plane, where the ordering of complex numbers is illegal, as it wouldn't make any sense. There are some people who claim that redefining sex to conform with our findings in human nature is too anthropocentric. This type of argumentation is called concern trolling. It's another form of the Motte-Bailey fallacy. It's the same thing when anti-trans advocates oppose trans women participating in sports because they care about women so much, even though the cis women themselves overwhelmingly don't mind competing with trans women. It's a silly argument, pretending to care about something that is of literally no importance, but I will still address it for the sake of completion. Simply put, humans are humans. Other animals are other animals. Different animals have different physiologies. It's perfectly normal to define certain terms in relation to humans, because we are the ones talking about ourselves. When we talk about other animals, we can use whatever other definitions fit best. After all, there are many things that are impossible to study in animals because we simply can't communicate with them. Since there are plenty of things that are specific to humans, we need words to describe them. Besides, sex variations exist in many animals, not just humans. Most mammals have intersex organisms in their populations. So why is it so important to redefine sex as not a binary? Can't we just continue to refer to sex as a binary and still support trans people? We could, and our lives would be mostly unaffected either way, but it would be inaccurate, and most importantly, it would undermine the established biological connection between sex and gender. We have a considerable amount of scientific evidence showing that sex and gender are not two independent concepts. Sex variations can actually influence gender identities. In humans, the SRY gene in the Y chromosome is what determines maleness. When the SRY gene is not present or not activating, it usually results in Swyer syndrome, the dysgenesis of the gonads. People with Swyer syndrome are almost always assigned female at birth because their external phenotype is female, despite their XY chromosomes. Swyer syndrome usually remains undetected until the person reaches the age of puberty and fails to menstruate. By the way, Richard Dawkins has an objection to this as well. On April 2024, he and Alan Sokal, a famously transphobic mathematician, co-wrote the following for the Boston Globe. The American Medical Association says that the word sex, as in male or female, is problematic and outdated. We should all now use the more precise phrase sex assigned at birth. The American Psychological Association concurs. Terms like birth sex and natal sex are disparaging and misleadingly imply that sex is an immutable characteristic. The American Academy of Pediatrics is on board too. Sex, it declares, is an assignment that is made at birth. And now the CDC urges to say assigned male or female at birth, or designated male or female at birth, instead of biologically male or female, or genetically male or female. This is true, by the way, though worldwide medical and biological consensus opposes Dawkins's views. The article continues. Much is speciously made of the fact that a very few humans are born with chromosomal patterns other than XX and XY. The most common, Klinefelter syndrome, with XXY chromosomes, occurs in about 0.1% of live births. These individuals are anatomically male, though often infertile. Some extremely rare conditions, such as the La Chapelle syndrome, 0.003%, and Swyer syndrome, 0.0005%, arguably fall outside the standard male/female classification. Even so, the sexual divide is an exceedingly clear binary as any distinction you can find in biology. Once again, Dawkins magically waves his hands and ignores evidence that contradicts his opinions. A baby's name is assigned at birth, no one doubts that, but a baby's sex is not assigned, it is determined at conception and is then observed at birth, first by examination of the external genital organs and then, in cases of doubt, by chromosomal analysis. Of course, any observation can be erroneous, and in rare cases the sex reported on the birth certificate is inaccurate and needs to be subsequently corrected. But the fallibility of observation does not change the fact that what is being observed, a person's sex, is an objective biological reality, just like their blood group or fingerprint pattern. not something that is assigned. The medical association's pronouncements are social constructionism gone amok. As Dawkins says, doctors don't perform chromosomal analysis on every baby that is born. Therefore, sex is indeed assigned at birth by doctors who look at the baby and decide that they are male or female. In the case of Swyer syndrome, the baby will look phenotypically female, while their chromosomes will be XY. People with Swyer syndrome are assigned female at birth, they are raised as female, and they usually identify as women. In fact, the prevalent medical treatment for Swyer syndrome is hormone replacement therapy to help individuals become more female. Similar things apply to complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, which I mentioned in my previous video. Instead of an SRY gene variation, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome is caused by a variation in the androgen receptor gene. People with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome have a fully female phenotype. They look female, they have breasts, a vulva, a vagina, but just like it is with Swyer syndrome, they don't typically produce any eggs, and they have an XY karyotype. People with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome are almost always assigned female at birth, raised as female, and usually identify as women when they grow up. These two examples seem to show how gender identity is affected by sexual phenotypicality. Of course, the exact causality has not been determined, and the current understanding is that gender identity is potentially influenced by all relevant factors: genetics, chromosomes, hormones, environment, and other psychosocial aspects. For example, one hypothesis is that because people with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome or Swyer syndrome naturally present as female, it becomes easier for a stable gender identity to develop in them, which is why most of them identify as women, even though they are chromosomally male and they typically can't produce eggs. The reason this is not hand-waved as purely environmental is because we do have neurobiological evidence indicating that gender identity is reflected in brain structure. There are several parts of the brain that were considered to be sexually dimorphic, like the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis and interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus number 3, but recent research has shown that they are actually gender dimorphic, meaning that the similarities in brain structure don't exist between sexes, but between genders. Trans people have been reportedly shown to have similar brain structure as cis people of the same gender. This confirms that gender has a biological component. Of course, this is nothing new. A lot of people who are not very well educated on this topic think that these things are new, that they represent wokeism gone mad, and other nonsense. In reality, these changes in definition started all the way back in the 1950s and have progressively changed as research continues. John Money, a sexology professor at Johns Hopkins University in the 1950s and 1960s, is credited with coining much of the terminology we use today, like gender role and sexual orientation, and developing the proto-theories on sex and gender that scientists use today. John Money made great contributions to the field of studying sex and gender, but he also made great mistakes, with many of his theories being proven wrong, sometimes with disastrous consequences. One of those was the tragic case of David Reimer. David Reimer was born in 1965, and a botched circumcision destroyed his penis. John Money managed to persuade David's parents to sexually reassign him and to raise him as a girl. John Money would continue to monitor both David and his twin brother Brian, and performed horrible experiments on both of them, violating pretty much every single ethical rule or standard that we adhere to today. As a result of these experiments, both Brian and David eventually committed suicide. David Reimer was given sex reassignment surgery to look female. He was raised as a girl, and during his adolescence, he was unknowingly administered hormone replacement therapy to develop breasts. Despite all of this, David always identified as a boy and exhibited symptoms of gender dysphoria. David Reimer's case serves as the first ever proof that gender is not exclusively social, thus suggesting the existence of an innate biological gender identity. David Reimer's case showed that a person's gender identity cannot be changed externally. Even if you perform surgeries to change someone's sex characteristics as a baby, give them hormone drugs without their knowledge, and brainwash them into thinking they were born this way, their gender identity will still persist. A lot of people, Dawkins included, whose knowledge of biology is stuck in a worldview from before the 1960s, seem to believe that gender is a made-up thing, that it doesn't exist, that it is a meaningless concept, but obviously this is incorrect. The ways we choose to express our gender may be cultural, but gender itself clearly has a biological component. There is something deep in everyone, an ineffable knowledge of what we are. And even though Dawkins likes to speak for all biologists by insinuating that researching gender is a waste of time, the reality is that there is a great deal of research currently happening on the genetics of gender identity all across the world, and the results confirm that Dawkins is wrong. Here is one of the many neurological studies showing that gender identity has a biological component. To avoid being accused of cherry-picking quotes, I will read the entire conclusion to you. The data summarized in the present review suggest that both gender identity and sexual orientation are significantly influenced by events occurring during the early developmental period when the brain is differentiating under the influence of gonadal steroid hormones, genes, and maternal factors. However, our current understanding of these factors is far from complete, and the results are not always consistent. Animal studies form both the theoretical underpinnings of the prenatal hormone hypothesis and provide causal evidence for the effect of prenatal hormones on sexual orientation, as modeled by tests of sexual partner preferences, although they do not translate to gender identity. Sexual differentiation of the genitals takes place before sexual differentiations of the brain, making it possible that they are not always congruent. Structural and functional differences of hypothalamic nuclei and other brain areas differ in relation to sexual identity and sexual orientation, indicating that these traits develop independently. This may be a result of different hormone sensitivities and/or separate critical periods, although this remains to be explored. Most findings are consistent with the predisposing influence of hormones or genes rather than a determining influence. For example, only some people exposed to atypical hormone environments prenatally show altered gender identity or sexual orientation, whereas many do not. Family and twin studies indicate that genes play a role, but no specific candidate genes have been identified. Evidence that relates to the number of older brothers implicates maternal immune responses as a contributing factor for male sexual orientation. All of these mechanisms rely on correlations, and our current understanding suffers from many limitations in the data, such as reliance on retrospective clinical studies of individuals with rare conditions, small study population sizes, biases in recruiting subjects, too much reliance on studies of male homosexuals, and the assumption that sexuality is easily categorized and binary. Moreover, none of the biological factors identified so far can explain all of the variances in sexual identity and orientation, nor it is known whether or how these factors may interact. Despite these limitations, the existing empirical evidence makes it clear that there is a significant biological contribution to the development of an individual's sexual identity and sexual orientation. As you can see, the evidence does support the existence of a biological aspect to gender identity. And it also shows that there is a lot of things we currently don't understand, which means we need to do more research. So Dawkins' flippant comment that biologists have better things to do than to care about gender is demonstrably ignorant and promotes a mentality of anti-science and anti-intellectualism. So I think I have established that this topic is far more complex than what TERFs and other anti-trans bigots want everyone to believe. The things we learn in high school biology are very crude simplifications of how sex and gender actually exist in nature. This is not unlike Bohr's atomic model. At school, we learn that atoms are like planets made out of protons and neutrons, with electrons orbiting around them like satellites. This is of course an obsolete model that scientists no longer use, but we still teach it to school children because it's considered more digestible and easier to comprehend. However, that doesn't mean it represents the extent of our scientific knowledge on the subject. And who knows, maybe in the future we will find another model that is even more accurate than this one. Maybe at some point in the future we will discover exactly how gender is formed, and maybe the concepts of sex and gender will merge back into one greater unifying model. But until then, we will use the current scientific terms as they exist to refer to these concepts, despite their limitations. A lot of people who are not very well educated in biology or similar complex systems expect simple definitions and clear-cut statements with 10 words or fewer, but that is literally impossible in biology. Even today, there still doesn't exist a prescriptive definition for what we call life, but that doesn't mean that the term itself has no meaning, or that we don't intuitively know what life is. So while it's true that we often use certain terms colloquially for convenience or practicality, It doesn't mean that these terms reflect reality as it truly exists. For example, we often say, "I have a theory," when we actually mean, "I have a hypothesis." In everyday speech, this distinction is negligible, but these are scientific terms that mean different things in certain contexts. So while we often use words like male, female, man, woman, sex, gender, very casually, maybe even interchangeably, without really thinking about biological definitions, and people intuitively know what we mean in everyday life, when we use these words in a scientific context, it is very important that we use the correct terms, otherwise we will cause confusion. And that is exactly the confusion TERFs wish to maintain whenever the topic of trans people is brought up. It's not a coincidence that every person who displays a religious obsession to older definitions of sex also happens to hold anti-trans views, because that is the final goal of all of this hollow rhetoric, to invalidate trans people. By obfuscating their true intentions behind loyalty to outdated science, they justify their bigotry in claiming that denying trans people their own identities is simply a side effect of their strict adherence to scientific reason. In reality, they distort science to promote their prejudice. They take advantage of the complexity of biology in order to push their political agenda. This is textbook politicization of science, and it's morally reprehensible.
If people express themselves on a gender spectrum, and that is an actual thing in an actual society, if we have not fully explained that scientifically, that's an interesting frontier to study. If you want to say it's only sociological, then it's the purview of the social sciences. I don't care who studies it. It's an interesting fact about society that's worth learning about. To fight someone and say, it's not biological, it's just your this, it's real and it's there.
Thank you for watching.